There are a great number of myths around the history of computing, tons and tons of them. And we are watching as a new one is created right in front of our eyes right now. And it's somewhat fascinating to watch this all unfold. And I'm talking about the myth that has come about in the last few days that Facebook considers Linux to be malware and is censoring people for you talking about Linux on Facebook. And going so far as apparently, according to many sites, banning groups and people simply for mentioning Linux or talking about Linux distributions or linking to a Linux distribution. All sorts of stories around this are going on constantly. And the more they get repeated, the more everyone simply accepts it as fact. And the amazing thing about this is, none of it's true. Not at all. What's really happening here is that one website, one known as distrowatch.com, apparently, and this is what we think happened, had a direct link to an archive on it. In that archive file, there was some viruses or some malware, or at least something that was detected as malware by a little virus scanner. And because of that, Facebook's anti-malware system flagged that particular website as potentially dangerous, as potentially having a cybersecurity threat. Nothing to do with Linux. People were not getting banned for talking about Linux, not at all. But that wasn't stopping news websites across the globe from repeating this story. Tom's Hardware had a big headline: Facebook flags Linux topics as cybersecurity threats, posts and users being blocked. Boing Boing said Facebook removing Linux discussions as security threats. NeoWin, Facebook apparently banning people from posting Linux related contents on its platform. Even friggin' MSN got in on the action. Is Facebook censoring Linux discussions? And they had big old headlines around all of this. And the thing was, again, none of it was really happening, but none of the tech journalists wanted to dive into it and actually do the research on this. Now, to be fair, the headline, Facebook considers Linux as malware. Facebook says Linux is a cybersecurity threat and bans Linux users. That's salacious. That's enticing. I wish I could write that headline because it's a great headline. It's going to get eyeballs. It's going to drive people to click. I get why they just would rather not want to investigate it, because if these journalists start investigating this story, which honestly is not that interesting of a story all by itself, if they start investigating it, it instantly becomes, oh, well, this isn't really a thing. Oh, this isn't really mass censorship. And it instantly loses its cool, right? There's no excitement. There's no salaciousness to say Facebook flags one website because that website might have had a security issue, but then that security issue was fixed and Facebook lifted the ban on that website. Like, that's just not that interesting of a story. That happens a million times every day on the internet. It's not that exciting. So they're not really diving into it. But the thing is, the more often all these websites, and I gave you 4 examples, but there's a non-stop examples, and all of those examples are being posted on Reddit and X and on Facebook. It's going everywhere to the point where people are beginning to just simply believe it because they're seeing it from 9 out of 10 tech news websites are posting it. They're seeing on every social and link aggregation platforms they go to. Therefore, it must be true. And this is exactly how so many tech myths, so many computer history myths propagate. One great example, and the Lunduke Journal has been covering tech myths and computer history myths for years, but one of my favorite examples is that of the first computer bug. This is an old myth, right? A lot of people have heard this before. The first real computer software bug was an actual bug. It was a moth. It was a moth that got into the circuits of an old mainframe, and they took a picture of it and they made a joke about it, and that's why problems and defects in software are named bugs, because it was originally an actual bug. No, that's not true. None of that's just not true. That's not a real thing that happened. It's a great story, though. And it's a great story that got repeated over and over again in all of the tech news outlets of the time, all of the tech magazines and periodicals and tech history books, even programmer books repeated this story over and over again. There was a series of books about testing computer software that were written back in the 90s, and this book was a primer on how to be good at testing software and be a good software tester and everything. And even that book repeated this myth that the first computer bug was a moth. Now, none of it's true, but if you ask most nerds, most computer nerds, they will tell you that it is true. It doesn't matter what the fact is. It's been repeated so often by so many people that it's accepted as fact. This happens over and over again. Another great one. 640K ought to be enough for anybody. Remember Bill Gates said that? Remember when Bill Gates said that back in the 80s? He said 640K ought to be enough for anybody. He never said that. He never said it. It's a great quote. It's a great quote. It drives a lot of interesting discussion about memory management and bloated software and Bill Gates being wrong. And it's great. It's a great topic starter. But Bill Gates never actually said 640K ought to be enough for anybody. Never did. He never said it. But it's been repeated so many times now by people who should know better that it's become true. Ask anyone, who is the first computer programmer? This is another great one. And so many people will be like, well, it's Ada Lovelace. Ada Lovelace was the first computer programmer. No, she wasn't. Absolutely was not. By no measure was Ada Lovelace the first computer programmer. She wasn't the first person to program computers. She never actually programmed on a computer. Like, there's no way you can possibly look at it and discern that Ada Lovelace was the first computer programmer, but it's been repeated so often that it's become true. Tim Berners-Lee invented HTML. Well, no, he copied someone else's work and he named it HTML. He literally did. He copied someone else's work and named it HTML. He took a subset of what someone else did, copied it verbatim, and named it HTML. Now, Tim Berners-Lee is not some evil, horrible guy, but he's credited as creating HTML and creating all this stuff. He didn't do, he did some work. He did some good work. And a lot of people are yelling at the screen right now because of me saying this. He did some good work, but he didn't invent HTML. And this goes on and on and on. Open source. Literally, now this is only of interest to people who are into open source and Linux and all that sort of thing, but there's a story that's been propagated in the open source world that the term open source was created in the late 1990s by a specific person at a specific point in time. And the story that gets repeated over and over and over again all the time is absolutely wrong. People say it's Christine Peterson. From February 5th, 1998, Christine Peterson. They say that over and over again. Just do a Google search. Who created open source? Who named the term open source? Who coined it? They'll say Christine Peterson. She didn't. She's nowhere near the first person to have used it in that context. But that doesn't stop people from repeating this over and over again. And here's the thing with this particular Facebook story, is it sounds plausible. That's the thing. That's what makes it such a great and insidious myth, right? On its face, it seems plausible. This is Facebook we're talking about. Of course they censor people. They censor people all the time. They are literally famous for censoring people. They worked with the President Biden administration and created software to help President Biden specifically censor American citizens. They are famous for censoring, right? So the idea that Facebook is censoring anyone for anything, it's reasonable. It sounds plausible, right? If you don't look into it any further, you'd go, well, yeah, probably. They probably censored somebody. And on top of all that, Linux getting censored is also nothing new. For example, I was doing a show predominantly published on YouTube back about, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago. And every time I published a video on YouTube where the word Linux was in the title of the video was instantly demonetized. Now, it was clearly just some sort of automatic script, and when I appealed that demonetization of those videos to YouTube, they always fixed it. It usually took them a while, but they always did. And I know I wasn't the only one where that happened. So the idea that there's some form of censorship around Linux is nothing new. In fact, do you remember when President Barack Obama, back in 2014, declared that the readers of Lunduke Journal magazine, this is a real thing that happened, were extremists. They created an extremist list, and they put all of the readers and contributors to the forum and the editors and writers of Lunduke Journal magazine on this extremist list, right? This is a real thing that happened back in 2014. And so President Obama said, yes, Linux users are extremists. And at the time, it was kind of funny, right? We even made up t-shirts about how I'm a Lunduke Journal extremist, right? It was ridiculous. It was goofy. It was insane. And it was nuts. But what that means is there's a long-standing history of censoring or labeling as bad Linux users. And you combine that together with the fact that Facebook just loves to censor people. I mean, they've been doing that for years. Yeah, you know what? Facebook censoring Linux, that's real plausible. Super plausible, such that websites like Tom's Hardware just runs with it. They said, yeah, Facebook flags Linux topics as cybersecurity threats and posts and users are being blocked. Is any of that happening? No. No, but it doesn't matter. It's plausible and salacious, and it's going to drive clicks and eyeballs, and people are going to be like, yeah, I love this headline, and they're going to share it. They're going to share it all over Reddit and everywhere else, and they're going to share it so many times that it's going to be an indisputable fact. Of course, mark my words. Doesn't matter how many times you and I scream from the rooftops that this is not happening, folks. Go 5, 10, 15 years from now, people will be like, oh yeah, remember when Facebook, they declared that Linux was malware and Linux users were spreading cybersecurity, and they started mass banning Linux users off the site. And there will inevitably be people like, oh yeah, I was one of the guys that got banned. All I did was I said, hey, this is Linux, and look at Linux, and I got banned, and Facebook banned me, man. That will happen. That will happen. It doesn't matter that it's fake. It doesn't matter that it's false. What we're witnessing is the creation of a new tech myth. These happen all the friggin' time. Drives me nuts because the reality is I could simply dive into this and say, yeah, man, Facebook is censoring Linux, man. And I would get a bunch of clicks for it. I would get way more eyeballs on the story, on the videos and podcasts and articles that I put out than I will for coming out and say, no, this is just a myth. This is a made up thing. I'll put out the truth. It'll get a tenth of the attention that I would get if I just put out the fake story of Facebook says Linux is malware, right? Facebook says Linux is malware. Well, people will be like, click, 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 click. It'll go crazy. But that's not what I don't like that, right? I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to just make up random stuff. I'm not going to run with obviously false stories just because I want the clicks. I'm not Boing Boing and Tom's Hardware and all the other websites that are running with it. I'm not going to do that because the computer history is important, right? At least to me. The history of computing is a critical part of our history, of the nerds' history, of the history of America, of the history of the world. This is an important and critical thing. And to fill that history with little itty bitty myths all over the place. You know, you do this one at a time, and each individual myth doesn't seem like that big of a deal. Oh, what's the problem with one little myth of Facebook says Linux is malware? Okay, we'll add that to what was the first computer bug named after? Bill Gates' 640K ought to be enough for anybody. Who the first computer programmer was? who really created HTML, who coined the term open source, on and on and on. You start going through those things, and you go through dozens and dozens of these sorts of myths, and all of a sudden, the history of computing as you know it is more or less just false. It's just a giant hodgepodge of myths that are not real, are not accurate, do not really tell you the true history. But here we are in real time watching a new myth be created. I guarantee you, you can see all the hallmarks of a great myth in this one. It's salacious, it's easy to disprove, but no one wants to disprove it. There are political motivators going on here. People are politically motivated for multiple reasons. Dislike of Facebook's current political attitudes, all sorts of different things. A desire to paint Linux users as a victim. All sorts of different things play into this here. And a bunch of you are going like, hey, stop making this about me. But you combine all these things together, and people have a motivating factor to not dig deeper into this, right? To not look into it, to not find out the facts that would ultimately disprove the headline of Linux censors people for saying, or Facebook censors people for saying Linux, right? They don't want to disprove that. So that's where we're friggin' at right now. We'll watch as over the next, week or so, this story will continue to be posted all over the place. We'll see more articles, more YouTube videos, more podcasts continue to talk about all of this. They will cement it hard in stone. And then every now and then, over the next several years, this topic will be brought up. Facebook says Linux is malware. Facebook censors Linux users. Facebook bans Linux groups over and over and over again until it's just accepted. And the Lunduke Journal will be left saying, guys, remember, this didn't actually happen, but okay. Thank you to the Lunduke Journal subscribers for making all of this possible. Go to lunduke.com, click on all the links. They're fantastic. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, nerds and nerdettes across the inner tubes, I do declare, end broadcast.